Thanks for tuning in to today's discussion of how to render interior elevations, and in particular elevations created in AutoCAD. And let's talk a little bit about what sort of style you can use in Adobe Illustrator. I have a Pinterest page, but I thought I'd show you the images that I culled from that page, just so you can get a sense of the different things that we're talking about. The biggest thing is to represent your interiors. You're going to need to show kind of materials, but also lighting, and of course architectural volume and architectural graphic standards. So for example, stairs need to be represented accurately, and you need to use different line weights and scale figures. Here, slightly different style, more focus on the daylighting, but also scale figures, materials, and in this case, kind of a standard shadowing pattern, as if the building were cut away. And you'll notice in a lot of these that using things like overlaps or sharper shadows to indicate depth is a common thing. And a lot of them use very distinct line weights to also help graphically represent 3 dimensions. And as a reminder, interior elevations, there's no wall, floor, or ceiling thickness, whereas the sections there are. And again, you can use Illustrator to help that graphic really be distinct. All right, so let's take a look at AutoCAD first, and how do we prepare our beautiful, elaborate interior elevation for use in Illustrator. The big thing here is if you've got AutoCAD line weights, use them. Okay, and I set this up so that the layers have line weights associated with them, and you can see here that these different objects are on different layers, and they are taking the properties from those layers. Also, what I like to do is in AutoCAD, I extract this interior elevation on its own. So I use the W block command to just select this interior elevation. And again, I'm going to assume that you know what I'm talking about here. This isn't terribly advanced AutoCAD. The base point actually doesn't matter all that much because Illustrator tends to ignore it. Anyway, just make sure that you save this into a folder that you're going to remember where it is, or if you need to, click the change button and you can create a new folder. If you're like me, you can never remember where you've saved things. So I usually write a block for the elevation, give it a name, maybe even north would be a good idea, so I remember what it is. What I also like to do is if I have something like scale figures or furniture that I want to show, and I know they're going to be on top of other objects, I'll export those as a separate W block, just so that they can be arranged in such a manner that they can be placed on top a little more easily. If it's all one object, you'll see when we get to Illustrator, it's a little difficult to manage. Okay, so that's the AutoCAD portion of this. Now, let's just take a little bit of a look at Illustrator here. First of all, why Illustrator? Why not Photoshop? Well, Photoshop is awesome, but and you can absolutely render a plan in Photoshop. I'm the last person to say that you can't do that. The big difference is with Illustrator, it works very nicely with what are called vectors. Vectors are different than pixels, or what's called raster images. Vector images, they're exactly how you create things in AutoCAD. They're basically like little mathematical formulas that describe paths, as opposed to just basically a grid of dots with different values for each dot. So we use Illustrator because it works so well with AutoCAD, because they're both vector drawing tools. All right, and actually, let me call up an image of the Illustrator interface just to quickly give you a sense of how it's arranged. It's very similar to a lot of our drawing programs. There's kind of a center menu or a center drawing area, in this case called an artboard, and you can actually have several artboards in a file. There's menus with lots and lots of design and tool options, settings, that kind of thing up here. A tool bar with the sort of most commonly used tools available. And there is a kind of bar up top, a control palette that shows options for main commands, drawing commands, or the drawing interface. And finally, there are these palettes over here on the right. I'm going to just do Command N or Control N. We'll get a new file. And obviously, you can call it whatever you want that makes sense for this particular project. There are a couple of presets here. I'm just going to go with a letter size arranged landscape format. Rather than try and set up like a whole board, you could absolutely do an entire board in Illustrator. I'm just going to do one page. I think my elevation should fit on that, no problem. And I'm not going to change any of the other settings. These are kind of advanced, so I wouldn't mess with those. And you end up with a blank sheet of paper. And what you can do is you can bring in your drawings from AutoCAD. The way you do that, you don't use the bring in command. You use what's called the place command. And placing objects, I don't know why they don't use the term insert or import or link. That's what they use. Choose the file that you created using the W-block command, in this case elevation and north wall. Make sure you show the import options. The reason I do this, I'll show you in a second here. When I go to place, these are the import options here. This allows you to set the drawing to physical scale. It's drawn at 1:1. 1 inch equals an inch in the original drawing. I want to make this 48 units equals 1 inch. What that does, that's essentially saying this is going to be a 1/4 inch equals a foot drawing. Okay, and if you are familiar with AutoCAD, you'll know that these are scale numbers. 96 equals 1/8 of an inch equals a foot in printed space. 24 is 1/2 an inch equals a foot. You can scale it later. Absolutely, you don't need to do it, but I'm going to do it now. Just it makes my life a little easier when I import other things. So I'll click OK. And now when I click once to place the drawing, it's actually the full size 1/4 inch equals a foot drawing from AutoCAD. All right. Now I can zoom in and out on this drawing using the Command plus or Command minus. There are also scroll wheels here on the bottom of my drawing interface. And the interface, you can see, has accepted the AutoCAD file, and it's even colored it differently. And there are, so now I can begin to manipulate it. It's pretty simple. You use the selection tool. That's looks like a black arrow with a kind of white outline. And you can select the object and start making changes to it. Now, the simplest thing you can do is change what's called the stroke color. Now, up here, you'll see this word stroke. The stroke is basically the line weight or line work. And you can change its color by clicking on this downward arrow here next to the question mark. The question mark is indicating that there's several colors here. I can just make that black. Okay, I'll just click off of it so you get a good view of it. And that looks very nice. It actually it has 3 different line weights and it looks pretty decent. I can also, if I wanted to, if I select the object again, I could change the line weight. Again, there are different line weights on here. If I change them all to 1, see how they all become very even? I don't really like that, though. I like it with the different line weights. But I want to change these lines in another way. I want to make them look like they're hand-drawn. To do that, you can use what's called a brush. Now, these brushes, right now we're using the basic one. You can use all sorts of different ones, but by default, there's this one here that looks like a charcoal filter. Now, if I apply that, that doesn't look so nice, but I can change the line weight, and you can see how it's a different effect. What I want to do, I don't want to change the entire thing. I just want to change some of these interior lines. So if you double-click on the object, now I'm actually kind of inside it, kind of like editing a block. I can click and drag a window and select just these interior elements. And now I can change them to a different type of brush. But that's not really my favorite brush. There are plenty of brushes that are not kind of already loaded into the drawing. if I come over here to the palette menu, the floating palette menu, you'll see that there is an option for brushes. I'll click on that. The main menu shows me just the brushes in the model, but down at the bottom you'll see it looks a little bit like a bunch of books leaning together, a very skeuomorphic icon for a library. And I can call up, there are all sorts of different brushes available, but I'm going to call up this one that's the charcoal pencil one. And what it shows you is a preview icon of what different pencils look like in your drawing. And then to apply them, all you do is click on the icon and it will apply it to whatever objects you've selected. Okay, and in this case, I've applied a pencil thick. It should pop into your main menu, and it will also pop into the available brushes here in your document. So, and I can scroll through this list. There are a lot of different brushes out there, so you can really create some interesting effects or borders or other strange things. You know, some are actually quite architectural. Some are just a little funky. I'm not quite sure what you'd use them all for, to tell you the honest truth. Anyway, and like I mentioned, these lines in here, you can change individual ones if you want sub-lines to have, say, different line weights, or have a different effect applied to those particular lines. Maybe these get a slightly different effect than those other lines. Okay. You can also copy the lines that are in there. Like, let's say I wanted a wall base. I can just use the select command, select that individual line, and then hold down Alt, and when I click and drag, it makes a copy. If I hold down Shift after clicking Alt, it will force it to be only on the orthogonal. This is kind of like the AutoCAD ortho mode. All right. And in fact, the similarities to AutoCAD go beyond that. If I'm drawing, say, a rectangle, and the rectangle tool looks suspiciously like the rectangle tool in AutoCAD, what you'll see is that the cursor is going to indicate any number of references to different objects. So when I draw, I can make reference to, say, O-snaps, what we would call O-snaps in AutoCAD. That might be a nearest O-snap or an aligned O-snap. One thing that AutoCAD doesn't have is the nudge command. I like the nudge command. I'm just tapping the arrow keys. You can probably hear it. And I can nudge things up and down or left and right. Anyway, I can apply these different line types to these different objects to get all the different elements in my project. So you see how you can pretty quickly start to develop a very interesting drawing. Obviously, finding the line weights and line types that you like is the most important part. So we've gotten all these lovely lines. What else can we do? We can color our drawing. Now, what I like to do, I like to have the line work on a separate layer from the colored drawing. I find it just makes it easier when controlling the graphic look of the drawing. The way you do that is you go to the Layers palette, and like AutoCAD, there are layers, all right? And I've been editing this group, so you see how it says isolation mode? I need to exit that isolation mode. It's when you're basically inside a group. You have to exit this in order to kind of go back to the, uppermost level. And what you'll see here, in fact, I can open this up. You'll see all the objects from AutoCAD. In fact, I can select them by just clicking this little target here. You'll see them pop up. Every object from AutoCAD comes in as its own layer, which is an odd way of doing it, but you know, that's the way it works. Well, anyway, I can select this entire layer and I can duplicate it just by clicking this flyout menu here. In the layers menu, I can duplicate this layer 1, and the reason I'm going to do that, I'm going to save one of these as my line work layer. I'll just double click on the name and call it line work. The bottom one I'm going to call colors. And each layer can be turned on and off independently just by clicking the little eyeball here in the menu. And of course you can click on it to make it current, just like in AutoCAD. Okay, So I now have this new copy here. That is my line work. Wouldn't it be nice if I could paint it? Well, it is very nice because you can paint it. If I move over here into my toolbar, there is something called the live paint bucket. Now, for some of you, that may not be the tool that is visible. If you click and drag on the arrow in the lower right of this menu, it will bring up tools that are hidden kind of underneath a stack of tools. Some of you may see the shape builder tool or the live paint selection tool. Anyway, I want the live paint bucket tool. Now, normally it won't work unless you've created what's called a live paint group. So I'm going to do, and that's basically a group of objects that Illustrator has defined as being valid boundaries for drawing or for painting. So if I select this object and I click the paint bucket tool, what you'll see is my cursor will tell me, oh, you know what? I'm going to change these objects into a special paint group if you click on them. And if you do click on them, it will give you a warning that, oh, you're going to lose all that nice line weight that you just created. The visual appearance cannot be supported as a live paint group. And that's fine with me. And that's why I created this separate layer. Now, when we come in here with the live paint bucket, what you'll see is that it highlights areas in this live paint group we've created. All you have to do is choose the fill color up here in the upper left. So for example, if I wanted, I don't know, a couple pieces of trim, I could paint them brown by just clicking inside these groups. And maybe I want the window to be blue, and I'll paint the wall, oh, I don't know, how about a kind of light beige color? Lovely. Okay, so you can quite quickly generate a colored drawing. Typically, these live paint groups, you see how it has a stroke that has a color? Usually with a live paint group, I make the stroke none. That's the red box with the slash through it that means none. I prefer that because I like to control the line weights separately. Again, I have this separate layer for the line weights that I can turn on and off. Okay, so there we go. I've created this live paint group. I've painted all these different areas. Well, what if I want to paint, modify individual little sections? Well, to do that, you can't really select these sub-objects in a live paint group. You need to do what's called expand it. And that converts each of this entire group, which is kind of glued together, into separate pieces, individual paths. I'll just click the expand button. Now, if I use this direct selection tool, this is the tool that allows you to select kind of sub-objects within a group. Now you see how I can select these individual objects. I'll just hit delete. I'm selecting this panel here. I can select this object and lower its opacity and kind of soften it up a little bit. Maybe this one gets a little softer. Well, I'll leave it the way it is. Also, when you select an object, you can also select objects that have similar appearances. Usually what I do, for example, if I want everything that's brown to be a little bit lighter, I can choose select the same fill color. Any object that has that same fill color will be selected. I could recolor it, or I could just kind of globally change its opacity. Okay, so there we go, some very simple effects. Now, what if I wanted to, say, add some texture? This bottom one here, I wish it had sort of, I don't know, a little scuffing or dot pattern. Well, to do that, what you can do, there's of course many ways, but the way that I like to do it is to use what's called a transparency mask. And where you find that, over here on the right side of your screen, there is a gradient menu. So I've selected the area I want to change. I click on the gradient menu, and there's a transparency tab here on that gradient menu, and it has a little preview of the object, and then it has this little area here where you can add what's called a mask. And that mask is great when you don't want to change any colors. You just want to add a little bit of, I don't know, scuffing or dot pattern, something like that. So if I double click on this, it will create a special mask. And there's a number of features, but the big one is you don't want it to clip away the object. You just want it to kind of cover up parts of the object. Now, whatever I draw with this mask selected, that's going to overlay with this color and cause it to either shine through or not, depending on the pattern. Now, I could draw a shape here, and I'll just draw a shape in front of this object. I don't usually draw it with any line color. And if I choose one of the standard patterns here, here's the one, Pompadour. What you'll see is that wherever this pattern is dark, the color underneath does not show through. Wherever it's light or white, the color does show through even more. And I can control that a little bit using the opacity, so it's more or less transparent. I don't particularly like that pattern though. What I want to do, I want to find a color that's a little more dotty, I guess. The way to do that, go to the swatches menu. I'll just click on it over here. It's right above the brushes menu that we looked at earlier. Click on that and it closes your other menu when you do this. Like the brushes menu, there is a library. And there are many different types of patterns here, but what I want to do, I want to just get a basic texture. I like these basic ones because they're all black and white. So I'm going to call up the basic textures menu. And what you'll see, by the way, if you go into this menu and you start scrolling around, there are a lot of patterns in here. Again, some are kind of batches of color, some are complicated photo-based patterns. But this one here I like because, again, they're black and white. I'm going to try this mezzo tint dot pattern. And like with the brushes, when I click on it here, it shows up in my available swatches menu. And it also applies it to the transparency mask that we were working with before. Let's go back to that. And like I did before, I can control the opacity. I can even invert it. Sometimes that doesn't work. And see if that does anything. I can also change this pattern here if I want it to be, say, smaller dots. There are a number of transformations that you can apply to an individual pattern. It's just an instance of the pattern. It won't change them all in your document. Just right-click on the pattern, choose Transform, and then in the Transform submenu, there are a couple of different options. The one I'm going to try is Scale. Okay, and the Scale menu, first of all, you want to check the Preview option. You also want to tell it to transform the patterns, but not the objects. Okay, and I don't believe you need to scale the strokes or effects because we won't be doing that. This is making it bigger. Let's try making it smaller. Let's see what we end up with. No, that's a little too small. Let's make it 80. Okay, there we go. And that's, just a little bit of a pattern on the wall. Okay, we could, if we make it smaller, by the way, it will be available on the screen, but it doesn't show up very nicely on the video. So I'm going to leave it at this 80% for now. Okay, and maybe I'll make it just a little less opaque, so it's a little more subtle. Now that is a very nice way to just take a color and transform it, and I can. So this has made a very nice pattern. Here, to exit editing this pattern, you just click on the image icon here in the transparency menu, and you'll kind of be back in the, normal editing mode. So my next goal is to add some wallpaper to this wall. That I think would make a nice feature. The way that you can do that is to insert or place a image of the wallpaper that you want. I happen to have some wallpaper right here. I'm going to borrow it from my file menu. I'll just place it right in the document. And by the way, I used Command-Shift-P to place objects. I use the keyboard shortcuts to speed up matters. When you place the object, you could, like before, insert it at a specific scale. In this case, I'm just going to bring it in as an image. But I want to use this object as a pattern. Well, guess what? If you go to the if you select the object and go to the object menu, there is a pattern option. You can just make it a pattern. When I do that, it will tell me, hey, I just added that to the swatches panel. It's that easy. Now it's a color which is available in my paint menu. And it brings up this pattern editor, which is quite complicated. But basically, it's guessing how big you want this pattern and how to be and how you want it to repeat. If you're happy with it, which usually it's pretty straightforward, it kind of tiles it. Just click the Done button. And now I'll just delete this guy, and let me select this sub-object here, and I can just click on the pattern to apply the paint. I could scale this like I did before, by the way, just using my transform tool, and there's a number of other features. One that's a fun one to do is hold down the tilde button and click and drag your mouse one direction or another, and you can move the pattern left or right. And this is nice if you want to drag the pattern and kind of center it on the wall, on the space, so it looks nice. So there we go. We have a fairly rich drawing. There's a few other things that we can do. For example, one that I like to do, sorry, I hit tab and it hit all my buttons, is to add some effects to a couple of these objects. For example, the wall pattern I find is a little bit bold. What I like to do is blur it ever so slightly so that it's not quite so, I don't know, photographic. There is an effect that does that, and you know what? It's called blur. It actually blurs it. There are a couple of blurs, actually, so you'll have to choose the one that works for you. I like the Gaussian one because it allows you, first of all, to preview it, but it allows you a nice control, and it kind of allows you to just blur it ever so slightly. And you can nudge this up, or you can type in a number, if you want to be more precise, and hit OK. And that just softens that image ever so slightly, and you can blur any object. I also like to add a drop shadow. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a drop shadow to this window frame. All I have to do is select the window and the frame. And if you're using a drop shadow, you're going to want to make sure that this object is in front of the others. Now, when I drew it, they were actually adjacent to each other, but sometimes you get some weird patterning if it's not sure which object is in front. So I'll move that to the front. And then there's another effect, and this one is under the stylized grouping, and it's called drop shadow. And drop shadow, like the other menus, you can click preview if you want to see what it's going to look like. And then you can change these values. For example, if you don't like it very strong, just change it to 60%. And you see how it's a lot lighter, or you could change it to 100%, and it will make it darker. Also, you can change the values of the X and Y offset. That controls how far it goes from the object. Now, this varies radically depending on the drawing and the size of the drawing and all that. The blurriness is how fuzzy it gets, I guess. And see how that's really soft, whereas you could also make it quite sharp. But this is kind of a good in-between. And you see how that just adds a little depth to the drawing. And I can actually select these other elements here, the wainscoting and or I guess it's a chair rail and the crown molding. And I could add that same filter. I could just apply it like I did before. Or I could adjust it to have more subtle control. Anyway, so that's an overview of how to change these different features. Now, the last piece that I'm going to do is add back in the scale figure and piece of furniture that I used before. And like we did before, we just place that object. Again, just make sure you show the import options. It's actually not that one, it's this one. A scale figure and table drawing. Just make sure it's done to scale. And I believe we used a 1/4 inch, which is 48 equals 1. And OK. It will give you an error message, or not an error, but a what do you want me to do message. because some of the colors from AutoCAD match. And I'll click OK. And again, you click to place the objects. The insertion point that it uses is not actually the insertion point that we used in AutoCAD. So what it does is it comes in, it's a group here in the menu, the layers menu. What a lot of people like to do is create a new layer, drag that layer up to the very top of the list, because every layer is opaque. And I'm going to drag this new group into this top layer, and that just makes sure that these guys, whatever I do to them, they show up on the top. Okay, and these objects, I can transform these like I did before. I can select them, change their stroke color to black, and I could even change their fill color to gray or something like that. And in fact, I could even select them and apply a drop shadow. Sometimes the drop shadow doesn't look quite as good on these, or it wants to be a little bit smaller. Maybe I'll make this 0.1 and 0.1. It's pretty small, but you don't want it to be too strong. Anyway, and now you can turn back on all your layers, and you really have a nice composition. One other thing you could do if you want to kind of tweak the drawing, you can, say, make the lines look a little rougher without actually using a brush. There's an effect, let's see, I believe it's under Stylize. Nope, it's under Distort and Transform, and it's called Roughen. And the Roughen filter, again, like other filters, it can do some funky stuff if you let it get out of control. Depending on the options that you have, but usually what I do is I'll make it fairly low detail and fairly low size. Whoops, not that low though. And sometimes this is a nice effect if you want the line to just look a tiny bit, I don't know, sketchy without it being too, make it look less hardline, I guess, is the way that I'm trying to explain it. Anyway, and that, again, not everybody likes that look, but I kind of think it's a little fun. The other thing that not everybody likes, but some people do, is adding in a scale figure that's a photograph. And like I mentioned before, we can bring in pictures. Let's see, I think I have a guy here. Oh yeah, it's a guy. And with him, I'm just going to, I'm not going to show the import options. I'm just going to place him and click and drag his size here and try to make it roughly the same size as the scale figure that's already in here. Okay. And maybe you'll find that that guy is nicer than the ones that you're using. And these objects, you can add things like the drop shadow to these scale figures. Sometimes that actually looks pretty good, kind of blends them into the image, or you can lower their opacity. That's kind of a stylistic thing. Not everybody likes the real people, not everybody. So one last thing that you can do besides adding scale figures is you can try to draw, I don't know, an approximation of electric lighting. And this is one that, I teach lighting, and sometimes I think, well, it's kind of faking it. It's not really good lighting, but it is kind of a graphic shorthand. And what you do is you basically draw little cones of light. And let me draw a cone shape. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a swatch. I'm going to go to my swatch library, and let me find a gradient that is what's called a fade. And these are created basically for this very purpose, to kind of create shading on areas. If you call up the menu, there's a number of different ones. Illustrator and Photoshop both use this grid of white squares to represent transparency. What this does, this fades from white to transparent. You can also there's one that fades to black, and it fades to white or black in different patterns. This fade to white, I'll click on it to make it current. It adds it to my swatch panel. And now when I draw a shape, I'll just draw kind of a, I don't know, a funny polygon here. What you'll see is that one side, the right side here, is brighter than the other. The other side is basically transparent. And in fact, I can come in using my direct select tool, and I can kind of drag individual anchor points around. And what I can also do is using the select command, if I move my mouse over the edge of this object, it allows me to rotate it. If I hold down shift, it forces it to rotate in kind of 45-degree increments. And so now I've got the kind of white area up at the top. I'm just going to nudge, whoops, I have one object selected. I'm just going to drag this guy kind of up close to the ceiling, and I will drag these anchor points in just a bit so that it looks like it's kind of more of a cone. Maybe I'll zoom in on this little guy a little bit here, make my life easier. Oh, I'm not using this direct selection tool, that's why it's not working. With the direct selection tool, you can grab these individual anchors, and you can make it into a nice handy-dandy cone shape, and it will stretch the gradient to fit whatever it is that you're drawing. And this gradient, I could leave it at 100%, I could fade it out, I could also apply one of those effects. I happen to like the blur effect here. Let's take a look and see if we can just kind of soften it ever so slightly. Again, you want it to feel like it's a lighting glow. See how that makes it look a little bit like there's a light? Now with the select command, I can just hold down Alt and Shift, and you see how it makes copies all in a row. Shift is what forces it to be in the orthogonal. Fortunately, there's no array tool, at least not that I know of, but if there was, that would be really awesome. I can drag this guy along, and if you have objects that are semi-transparent, you can get some weirdness there. It's hard to see. It's sort of like the light is shining through this guy. So you might want to change the drawing order so that you don't get kind of weird effects. But you see how that last little bit of lighting effects really kind of adds, a little extra something to the drawing. Add one more over there. Gives it a little depth and a little richness. So in summary, that is how you render an interior elevation in Adobe Illustrator. You start with AutoCAD and you manipulate the line work and the colors and materials, and eventually try to even fake in some lighting through shadows or through filled kind of cones.